So we'll start this week with the anatomy of the nervous system. Now, the nervous system can be divided into multiple parts, and sometimes they do overlap. So the first division we can make is between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is composed of the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is meant to be everything else, including the nervous system of the gut. There is, however, some overlap. That distinction is not absolute, and there are nerves from the peripheral nervous system that innervate the brain and spinal cord. We also have the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system, and what you can see is that there's a lot of overlap between these two and the central and peripheral nervous systems. The autonomic nervous system controls your cardiac and smooth muscles, so those are the muscles that you cannot control voluntarily. The autonomic nervous system also controls involuntary responses and has two subdivisions, the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system is involved in regulating the functions of homeostasis, the things that keep you running that you don't want to think about. So the way that your liver functions during times of rest, regular routine function, as opposed to the sympathetic nervous system, which is more physiologic response, fight or flight. A great example of that, you can actually get the same response from the two different divisions of the autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic and sympathetic. So sweating can be caused by either system. If it's your parasympathetic nervous system, then you're probably sweating to cool down in response to a temperature increase, as opposed to the sympathetic nervous system, where the sweating might be in response to fear. The somatic nervous system controls your skeletal muscles, and of course, those are the ones that you can control voluntarily. Although, not every action of the somatic nervous system is something you're consciously choosing to do. It also regulates the habituated responses, the things that you do because you've done them so many times that your body just knows. The functions of the nervous system. Clearly, sensation. Okay, the nervous system is responsible for detecting stimuli in your environment, both stimuli outside the body and then those within the body. The nervous system also needs to produce a response. So once you've detected a sensation, the body needs to make a response to it. It can be a voluntary response, such as if you touch something hot, you move your hand away, or an involuntary response, not necessarily something that you don't want to do, but something that you don't consciously control. And then, of course, you have to be able to integrate these two things. So you have to be able to integrate and interpret the sensations to generate an appropriate response. Now, that integration process not only includes the current stimuli, one or many, but also your memories, your past experience, the current state of the environment in which you're working in, because the decision about what to do is not just based on what's immediately happening in the moment, but based on all of your history and experience with situations of that kind. And so one of the best examples of what sensory integration is that I could come up with is here. So sensory integration is the reason that you respond differently in these two scenarios. So on the surface, they're the same. Person encounters bear. But of course, clearly you're going to respond differently if you're walking down an abandoned forest road than you will if you encounter a bear in the zoo. And it's sensory integration that allows you to generate two very different responses to those on paper similar scenarios. Interestingly, there's a condition called sensory processing disorder. It's not terribly well defined, but it's this inability to integrate the stimuli that you detect causing an inappropriate response. So, you spot a bear in the woods and you run up to hug the bear. That's an inappropriate response. However, for people who actually have this, what you're much more likely to see are over or under response. So you see something funny and you laugh so hard you fall off your chair. You get a paper cut and burst into tears. Over or under response. Now, the neuron, of course, is the sort of flagship cell of the nervous system, and we'll talk a little bit about its structure. So it has a cell body, which you can see up here in orange. That's where the nucleus is and most of the organelles of the cell. The neurons have several processes, including dendrites and axons. So the dendrites are projections generally near the cell body that receive signals at one end of the cell. So they're the ones that detect incoming signals either from adjacent neurons or potentially from environmental stimuli. The axon, many neurons only have one, occasionally you'll see two, but it's a much longer projection from the cell body, and it's the axon that transmits the nerve potential or the action potential down the length of the axon and then on to the next neuron if that's what happens next in that particular neuron chain. Additionally, you have the myelin sheath, which in the central nervous system is composed of oligodendrites, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. In essence, the myelin sheath is a covering that wraps around the axon and helps to make the transmission of the action potential more efficient. In between the sections of myelin sheath, you have what are called nodes of Ranvier, and they're also important for signal transmission. Finally, at the terminal end of the axon, you have the synaptic bulbs, which are small sections of the neuron that can actually release signaling molecules into the synapse, which is the space between two neurons. Types of neurons. So multipolar neurons are the ones that we think of when we think of neurons, but there are several types. You can have unipolar neurons. Now, in this sense, this is a neuron that doesn't have a bunch of dendrites. They tend to be sensory neurons, and while it looks like they have two axons, they really have one that branches fairly close to the cell body. You can also have bipolar neurons. Those are fairly rare in humans, although you do find them in the olfactory epithelium, responsible for detecting smell, and in the retina. And then the multipolar neurons that are sort of what we think of as classic neurons. And there's any number of different types of shapes that multipolar neurons can take. Even though they all follow sort of the same basic pattern, you can get lots of different variation there. In addition to neurons within neural tissue, you also have what are called glial cells, and these are the cells that support the neuron tissue. So these are not neurons themselves, but they're closely associated with neurons. You have astrocytes, oligodendrites, microglia, ependymal cells, and these are the glial cells of the CNS. So starting with astrocytes, so named because they are star-shaped, they essentially support nutrition for neural cells. Next up are oligodendrites. So one oligodendrite can actually have many different projections that wrap around the axons of multiple neurons, forming the myelin sheath. So in the CNS, the central nervous system, one oligodendrite can provide myelin sheath segments for multiple neurons and multiple segments for a single neuron. The microglia are essentially the immune system of the neural tissue. And they perform similar functions, much like we talked about having immune cells in skin, you have immune cells in nerve tissue. And finally, we have the ependymal cells, and they're responsible for making the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, interestingly, the glial cells, this group of cells, all contribute to the blood-brain barrier, which is essentially an invisible barrier of a sort that prevents potentially harmful substances from within the blood that circulates throughout the brain from getting into the neural tissue where it might cause a lot of damage. And this is important because protecting the brain, keeping it safe from invaders, is critical to the normal function of the body. Now, the glial cells of the peripheral nervous system are a little bit different, but they are there. And in the peripheral nervous system, we have satellite cells and Schwann cells. Now, the satellite cells essentially perform some of the similar functions to the astrocytes in the central nervous system. They surround and sort of coat the cell bodies of the peripheral neurons. They're found in ganglia, okay, because that's where the cell bodies are found. And they provide support functions much like the astrocytes do in the central nervous system. The Schwann cells are the peripheral nervous system corollary of the myelin sheath. So it's still myelin sheath, but in this case, it's provided by the Schwann cells actually wrapping themselves around the axons of the neurons. But unlike the oligodendrites in the central nervous system, they don't branch out to provide multiple segments of myelin sheath. One Schwann cell is one segment of myelin sheath. So I thought we should end by sort of walking our way through a classic neural pathway so you get a sense of how all these parts come together. So in this example, we start with Sensory nerve endings in the skin. In this case, we're detecting water on the hand. Maybe it's hot water. So that creates a signal that is sent up the sensory neuron, so up the axon, and goes up through the spine and then comes up the spine towards the brain. It enters the spinal cord and then up the spinal cord where it synapses with the brain. It passes through the thalamus, that's a major conduit for neurons coming up through the spine. And finally, we reach the cerebral cortex where you are now consciously perceiving the sensation of hot water on your hand. But of course, that's only half of it. Now that you've perceived it, you might wish to make a response, to make a change to your behavior. And that brings us over to the motor neuron. So an upper motor neuron, which is going to run from the brain to the spinal cord, it executes a motor command. So now the action potential is moving back down out of the brain and into the spinal cord, where the upper motor neuron synapses with the lower motor neuron, and the action potential is then traveling along the lower motor neuron to the hand, allowing you to contract the skeletal muscle, voluntary contraction of skeletal muscle, which will move your hand away from hot water. And that's how the system is all meant to work together.